Yes, that's right, I'm finally holding what a lot of you consider to be a proper sword. You know, like a knight's sword, like knights in armour in the olden days used and that. You can see that it's the standard European late medieval sword. It has a straight tapering blade, long straight or not far off straight quillons, and unusually for a sword, a weighted pommel. This one is a one-handed sword. You can tell because the grip really is only made for one hand. I can, however, put a second hand on the pommel, and that works fine, but it's not really designed for that primary use. Now, I'm not a fan of this style of sword. Waving this about now, this doesn't feel, to me, right. However, we don't really know all that much about how this style of sword was used, and I'm going to guess, since people did use them for a fair while, and quite a lot of people use them, that it's just that there's something I don't know about how these swords were used. If I were fighting with a shield, I don't think this is the sort of sword I would choose, but it would depend on what my opponent's using. So, unless I know exactly what these were for, I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad. The fact, though, that they were used by lots of people for lots of time does suggest that they couldn't have been rubbish, could they? Now, this design, you'll notice, carries on through to another sword, like this one. To me, this one feels much nicer in the hand. It's thinner, it's a little bit lighter, and it's got a sort of swish to it. And you'll notice it's got a much longer handle. It's very easy now for me to put a second hand on. So, what is this? In the first Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rulebook, I remember that longsword and bastard sword were two separate weapons. But were they? It's debatable. In England, in tournaments, they had separate categories for bastard sword and longsword competitions, suggesting that they were maybe different weapons. But the thing is that there is a continuum. Weapons, swords like this, they have blades that sort of get longer and shorter, and handles that get longer and shorter. And this, for instance, is a very similar size, and some people would call this one a bastard sword or hand-and-a-half sword, which is the same sort of thing. But other people might, dispute that and call it a two-handed sword, or they would say, no, that's a long sword. But what's the difference between a long sword and a bastard sword? Well, since there is a continuum of sword sizes, I'm guessing it comes down largely to what you intend to do with it and who you are. What is your fighting style? Who taught you? Up against what opponents are you going? And where are you from as well? The bastard sword seems to be something of an English thing. We don't get many references, in fact, hardly any references in Europe to it. And yet, in England, quite definitely, people were using bastard swords. Now, a bastard sword and a hand-and-a-half sword are the same thing. You can use it either in one hand or in two. So some people would imagine then that sometimes you would use one of these with a shield. But actually, that's not what they're talking about. You can use it in two hands, and as you're fighting, you can, perhaps to get a bit more reach, go to one hand and then come back to two hands. So you'd be not using a shield, you would be fighting with it, using it two-handed, and then swapping just every now and then. You could do it's a bit of a cheats move. You could go ha-ha like that and get a bit more reach than you could get if you're still holding it with two hands. So it's a bit of a surprise move. It's a technique thing, the bastard sword. And certain sizes of sword would suit certain people for use in that way. But there's no point at which a longsword, also sometimes referred to as war sword or knight sword, there are so many confusing terms, they're all largely interchangeable. Now this one, you see, is definitely longer, and I would not call this a bastard sword because in one hand this feels really feeble. I don't have the control over it, I don't have the power. If I started a swing with two hands on it and then went to one hand, I could, though I'd be very vulnerable, I could get a bit of extra reach and do someone some damage and hope then to recover quickly and go back to two hands. But this feels more like a longsword to me than a bastard sword because of the weight of it. And swords that are, again, this same shape get longer again, and the supposed limit is here, just under your if you stand like that, if it comes up to there, just under your arm, supposedly that's the limit. And when I've handled swords that are that long, I definitely feel that they are two-handed swords. I'm also a little bit tired when people correct me when I say two-handed sword and they say, you mean spy-hander. which is German for two-handed. That doesn't actually solve anything. It's just the same thing but with a different name. There is another sword called the Great Sword, and I made another video about two-handed swords. I suppose I was really talking about the Great Sword. They're the ones with the blunt section there and the second set of quillons, and they are colossal. They usually have handles about this long, and absolutely they are two-handed and only two-handed weapons. This, for me, I would say it's a two-handed weapon, but it's maybe not quite so long and heavy that I would call it a two-handed sword. So for me, this is a longsword. For me, this is a bastard sword. But that's just me.